in a way that doesn't once again lead to judges ruling him unconstitutional. Tonight, the cascade of accusations and statements flowing from Trump's rambling White House news conference still going on now, 1 hour or more since he began.
Quiet.
Also tonight, 2 more suspects arrested in Malaysia in the mysterious death of Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of the North Korean leader. Settling old scores, sending a message to Trump's America. What is going on? Riots and arrests in the inflammable outskirts of Paris after a policeman is accused of raping a black youth worker suspected of dealing in drugs. And the indignity of growing old in modern Britain. Age UK says that a combination of spending cuts and rising costs has left 1 million elderly without the care they need and a system in a state of collapse.
Plus, a special report tonight from the only state school that specialises in teaching autistic girls. But this exceptional place can only handle some 70 children at a time, and the diagnosis of autism in girls comes later than that for boys.
When people don't understand me, I feel really annoyed. Like, can you just listen and blah?
So in the last hour, President Trump has been hitting out at what he called the dishonest media, claiming that despite reports of chaos in his administration is running like a fine-tuned machine. In a long and at times subdued press conference, Mr. Trump repeatedly defended his election victory and leapt to the defence of the national security advisor he sacked, who he said had done nothing wrong. Live now to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. Kylie.
John, this is still going on. It's an extraordinary kind of freewheeling, boastful but very authentic performance by the president. He's been speaking for more than half an hour now, fielding questions. I think it should wrap up fairly soon, but he began kind of in a very disciplined way, listing all his achievements since he's taken office, since he said he inherited a mess at home and abroad that was left him by the Obama administration. He repeatedly accused the media of trying to attack his administration, at times almost sounding like a media reviewer, critiquing the tone of particular news shows, singling out particular networks, applauding certain programs in great detail. He clearly spends a lot of time watching television. More substantively, though, he defended Mike Flynn, the national security advisor, who he sacked 2 days ago. He said that General Flynn did nothing wrong. He was just doing his job when he spoke with the Russians, but he shouldn't have lied to the Vice President Mike Pence. That's why he was sacked. The president denied repeatedly that he himself has anything to hide about his relations with Russia, and roundly rejected any suggestion that his administration is in turmoil. Let's hear what he said.
I turn on the TV, open the newspapers, and I see stories of chaos. Chaos. Yet it is the exact opposite. This administration is running like a fine-tuned machine.
So while the president has been trying to kind of reset the focus, his defense secretary and secretary of state are out in the world renegotiating foreign policy. Here's Lindsay Hilsum with this report.
We're going to find the leakers. We're going to find the leakers. They're going to pay a big price for leaking.
He's appointed an investigator into who leaked information about his team's contacts with Russia, not into whether those contacts were lawful, while his more sober envoys sally forth to try to calm allies.
What we will do is we will engage politically. We are not in a position right now to collaborate on a military level.
He conceded that the Russians may have intervened in the U.S. election.
Right now, I would just say there's very little doubt that they have either interfered or they have attempted to interfere in a number of elections in the democracies.
But surrounded by those dedicated to resisting Russia, he had nothing to say on allegations that key members of Trump's team cooperated with the Russians. And at the G20 in Bonn, the Russian Foreign Secretary was in full denial mode.
We should know that we do not interfere in domestic matters of other countries.
His US counterpart has the ability to say nothing while saying something, a reassuringly diplomatic skill given the alarm his boss has caused European leaders with his praise of President Putin.
The United States will consider working with Russia
when we can find areas of practical cooperation that will benefit the American people. Where we do not see eye to eye, the United States will stand up for the interest and values of America and her allies.
In Moscow, President Putin was addressing his security agents and spies, wondering if he and President Trump will be frustrated in their desire to resume cooperation blocked by NATO after Russia annexed Crimea.
It's in everyone's interest to resume dialogue with the intelligence agencies of the United States and the other members of NATO. It is not our fault that it was disrupted and is not developing.
I really appreciate you folks. You folks have been so great.
Such a relief to be amongst admirers, because governing is complex and requires deep reading and attention to detail, not just getting votes or receiving gifts. Senate Democrats want something from him, documents on his team's links to Russia. He tweeted today that they had to come up with a story to explain why they lost the election, so they made up the Russia controversy, fake news.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you.
Yesterday, standing beside the Israeli Prime Minister, the president cast doubt on the long-standing policy of a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians.
So I'm looking at two-state and one-state, and I like the one that both parties like.
Then today, his UN ambassador said no, the policy was two states, as agreed with other Security Council members, just the same as it's been for a quarter century. How he loved the election, the rallies, the crowds, the adulation, the winning. How happy those days must seem now.
Lindsay Hilsum, now this press conference is still ongoing, and there have been moments, certainly I think, where it has felt like a campaign performance, the same rolling narrative, switching from subject to subject, bashing the media, boasting about the defeat of Hillary Clinton, and now talking about his urban strategies and reaching out to the African-American community. Let's just hear what he's talking about now.
Even leave in the middle of the day. They're living in hell. We can't let that happen. So we're going to be very, very strong. It's a great question, and it's a very difficult situation because it's been many, many years. It's been festering for many, many years. But we have places in this country that we have to fix. We have to help African-American people that, for the most part, are stuck there, Hispanic American people. We have Hispanic American people that are in the inner cities, and they're living in hell. I mean, you look at the numbers in Chicago. There are two Chicagos, as you know. There's one Chicago that's incredible, luxurious, and all, and safe. There's another Chicago that's worse than almost any of the places in the Middle East that we talk about and that you talk about every night on the newscasts. So we're going to do a lot of
Donald Trump beginning, we think, at least to wrap up this press conference, but making those kinds of comparisons, sweeping comparisons between the Middle East and inner city crime in the United States. Now, this is the kind of performance that I think for his supporters, they will be thrilled. This is a return to the Donald Trump of old. It's him kind of sloughing off the shackles of Washington and the establishment and really throwing the kinds of punches that they love to see him throw on the campaign trail. But I think for those who have watched with some degree of horror the kind of unfurling kind of uncertainty and turmoil around key initiatives that this president has tried to launch, I think there will be real concern at a kind of lack of focus and lack of discipline. But that's where we are, a very divided America, a divisive president, kind of delivering a performance worthy of a Vegas showman here today.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Matt.
Thanks, John. Now, North Korea, remember North Korea, didn't even get a look in Trump's rambling press conference turned tirade. Perhaps it should have done. 2 more suspects have been arrested in Malaysia over the mysterious death of the North Korean leader's half-brother, Kim Jong-nam. He's thought to have been targeted by assassins while boarding a flight from Macau at Kuala Lumpur Airport. But the full details are still emerging. And just like everything else coming out of North Korea, out of that totalitarian hermit state, nothing is really as it seems. From the Malaysian capital, here's Kieran Jenkins.
Is this the hit woman who poisoned Kim Jong-nam? Malaysian police now have 3 people in custody. A woman with a Vietnamese passport arrested yesterday, an Indonesian citizen and her boyfriend arrested today. So many questions over this man's death, not least what's Indonesia got to do with it? It's like a mystery novel, said an unnamed diplomat in Kuala Lumpur earlier. And this is where it's set. Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The latest theory from Malaysian authorities that while travellers went by pushing trolleys, Kim Jong-nam was jumped by two women who shoved a poisoned cloth in his face. The unconfirmed timeline has Kim Jong-nam checking in around 8 a.m. on Monday, barely taking a few steps when the two women pounced. He sought help, rushing to an information desk. In the arrivals hall, his alleged attackers parted ways, one entering a toilet, the other disappearing. Kim Jong-nam is hurried to the airport clinic, while one of the women leaves the toilet and swiftly exits the building. So we're outside the arrivals hall. This is pretty much the spot the alleged killer was standing when she was captured by CCTV. Now, for a supposed secret agent, she was looking pretty damn conspicuous. 29 years old, with a Vietnamese passport. Her T-shirt said LOL. Her face, more OMG, according to an airport worker who told a Malaysian newspaper the woman looked a nervous wreck. The plot is thicker than the sort of films that are banned in North Korea, whose embassy car muscled through reporters last night outside the hospital where, according to reports, they lobbied unsuccessfully to prevent an autopsy. In North Korea today, they laid flowers called Kim Jong-ilias, named after and in memory of Kim Jong-il, the man who froze out his oldest son in favour of his youngest. Kim Jong-un may just have consolidated his grip on this isolated country. Whether his brother was a genuine threat or not, it seems he wasn't waiting to find out. And all this in a week that points to Kim Jong-un becoming ever bolder. Now tear yourself away from the bizarre details for a moment and consider that when he ambled through this airport on Monday, Kim Jong-nam was under Chinese protection. This happened under Chinese noses. And for North Korea to defy, even embarrass, perhaps the one state that likes to think it can reason with Pyongyang, well, that's a worrying development by any standards. President Trump will also be watching closely for anything more explosive than fireworks coming out of Pyongyang, where so far no official comment on the assassination, despite bearing the hallmarks of Kim Jong-un's violent, ruthless streak. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Kuala Lumpur.
Well, with me here in the studio is Paul French, the author of North Korea's State of Paranoia. Paul, how paranoid should we be? How paranoid should China be about what is going on in Pyongyang?
Well, China, I'm sure, is furious because Pyongyang is taking no notice of any advice from China. Clearly, it's all about timing. And with the missile launch on the weekend, showing that the nuclear program is still going, let's assume the assassination this week, it's a very clear message to the Trump administration.
So this is North Korean diplomacy by other means?
This is two massive moves on the chessboard.
And I mean, is it also part of consolidating his own position of power in the country? I mean, that seems to have been going on for months, if not years.
Very much so. We thought that was over last year when he probably executed as many as 75 people, up to and including his uncle. This seems a reiteration of that consolidation, a message to America that I'm in control, and if you're going to deal with anyone, you've got to deal with me.
But what is the point of that? Is he trying to scare the Americans to the negotiating table? Is he basically throwing his toys out of the pram, saying, while all you guys are interested in Washington, I'm still here. I'm still me.
Well, Kim Jong-un, like Kim Jong-il, hates being ignored. And he does feel ignored. We don't know what the Trump administration's Korea policy is. It's a complete mystery. Donald Trump just said he's not going to tell us. Kim Jong-un doesn't know what it is either. So he's decided to move, I think, in advance of that.
How dangerous is this situation?
Well, it's not dangerous in the sense that we need to feel an immediate threat. However, the missile launch last week did show that they are still moving towards a deliverable nuclear weapon. We've seen atomic explosions, and we're seeing missile launch after missile launch. At some point, they will be able to put the bomb on the missile and launch it, and that's when it gets dangerous.
But also, apart from nuclear missiles, I mean, they have the fourth or fifth biggest army in the world. They've got 1 million men under arms. They're right next to one of the biggest Asian cities, Seoul.
Yes, absolute threat to Seoul, and 35,000 American troops and dependents still in South Korea. That remains a flashpoint. Yeah.
What do you think the policy of the Trump administration should be towards North Korea?
Well, we don't know. I mean, it could either be the Clinton-era type engagement policy or the Bush II type era of vilification, axis of evil. The point is, either one plays to Kim Jong-il. Either he gets accepted at the table with the big boys and gets more aid, or he gets to hunker down, be vilified, tell everyone in the country that he's defending them, move towards his nuclear weapon. It's a win-win for him.
But it's anybody's guess at the moment, isn't it?
We really don't know.
OK, Paul French, thanks very much. John.
Scores of people have been arrested as violent protests spread across France, sparked by allegations that a young black man was raped by a police officer earlier this month. There were more clashes today just north of Paris as riot police tried to disperse demonstrators calling for justice. One officer has been put under formal investigation over the incident. The youth worker, whose full name has been withheld, is still being treated in hospital. Porrick O'Brien is in Paris, and his report does contain distressing details of the attack.
The City of Light, last night. The latest in 2 weeks of demonstrations and disturbances. Last night, the odd flare burning. On other occasions out in the suburbs, it was the cars. The difference, yesterday, this was around the corner from the Gare du Nord. What sparked it all? What happened in the suburbs of Aulnay-sous-Bois on the 2nd of February. A 22-year-old youth worker called Theo intervened when he saw a group of officers questioning someone. Then, filmed by an onlooker, they turned to the youth worker. According to his account, he was assaulted by police, an attack which he says included a baton being forced into his rectum. One officer faces charges of aggravated rape. 3 others have been charged with aggravated assault. The men deny the charges and have been suspended from the police force. The incident has reopened wounds in the relationship between the French police and the neighbourhoods of the banlieue, the suburbs.
We ask for justice, the real one, not a facade justice like always with the police when they act as criminals and they never get prosecuted.
But crucially, of course, this is a presidential election year. President Hollande visited the youth worker in hospital and spoke of the young man's dignity after the visit.
I had the chance to meet the young man, Theo, who had the presence of mind, the dignity, to make an appeal for calm.
Now, that original incident involving the police and the youth worker was initially described by police investigators as an accident, which has fanned the flames as far as some of the demonstrators and rioters are concerned. Today, in the suburb of Bobigny, just now, there were skirmishes. So all eyes are well and truly on the streets of Paris to see what will unfold tonight, and particularly, of course, the eyes of Marine Le Pen. She's framing this in terms of immigration and in terms of law and order. Lots of the areas where there have been trouble are poor, large, ethnically diverse communities. So the big question now is, first of all, how will it unfold over the coming days and weeks in terms of violence on the street? But the bigger question, by a long way, is how will this play into the narrative around the French presidential election?
Indeed. Porrick O'Brien in Paris there. Well, the Irish government has begun to identify places where customs checkpoints could be set up once again on the border with Northern Ireland in preparation for the UK leaving the EU. It follows Brexit talks between Theresa May and her Irish counterpart, Enda Kenny, last month. Officials say the work is only a contingency and that they do not expect a return of what both the British and Irish governments have called the borders of the past.
Well, in Strasbourg, the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has hailed a controversial trade deal with the EU, saying the world would benefit from a stronger Europe. But critics say the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, known as CETA, will give too much power to multinational corporations and widen the inequality gap. The significance of this deal for both Canada and the European Parliament is clear. Just one day after the CETA free trade agreement was ratified, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau flew to Strasbourg to address EU leaders, becoming the first leader from his country to do so.
If we are successful, CETA will become the blueprint for all ambitious future trade deals.
The deal removes barriers on most traded goods and services between Canada and the EU and could come into effect as soon as April. The Canadian leader celebrated the new trade pact, saying it will create jobs and boost the middle class on both sides of the Atlantic. He emphasized the strong relationship between his country and the European Union.
We believe in democracy, transparency, and the rule of law. We believe in human rights, and we believe in inclusion and in diversity. We know that in these times, we must choose to lead the international economy, not simply be subject to its whims.
But the New Deal is not without its critics. As it was struck yesterday, protesters gathered in Strasbourg. And inside the European Parliament, critics voiced their concern.
CETA is a bad agreement. It is just good for multinationals, and we're not in favour of that. We are in favour of the choices made by millions. This is a terrible agreement. It removes almost all customs duties on products traded between Canada and the EU and will undermine hundreds of thousands of jobs in Europe and tens of thousands in France.
The pact is seen as a possible model for a future EU-UK trade deal. But it has taken 8 years of negotiations to reach this stage, and many want to stop it from going ahead. Earlier, I spoke to the Canadian High Commissioner to the UK, Janice Charlotte. I started by asking her why the deal took 8 years to negotiate.
I think that the Canada-EU trade agreement is a very comprehensive undertaking. It is the most modern, progressive trade agreement that Canada has ever signed. It is with a constellation of countries with a variety of different interests. And so it may have taken us a long time, but it's a worthy goal worth celebrating today.
The critics have said this is really going to do great things for a narrow elite. And in fact, even Prime Minister Trudeau at one point sort of said whether that might be true.
It's incumbent upon Canada and the government in Canada, as well as all the governments in the EU, to be able to explain to their citizens why trade agreements like the CETA agreement are actually in their interests. In their interests as consumers, in their interests as workers, in their interests as taxpayers in an economy that's going to grow as a result of these new trade opportunities.
Will such a deal, say, between us and you, take 8 years?
As long as the UK is part of the EU, the businesses and investors in the UK will benefit from the CETA agreement. So that's a minimum of 2 years. And so we'll know that companies like Warburton's, one of the, I think the largest importer of Canadian wheat in Europe, company that imports wheat in Europe, and they've been imported for 140 years, they will enjoy lower prices on the wheat because of the tariffs will go down. Clark's maple syrup in Wales will enjoy a reduction in the 8%
But this
tariff.
is just for 2 years.
Well, it's 2 for 2 years, but I think that we have an opportunity through negotiations that we'll have to obviously finalize after the Brexit conversation finishes to preserve that market access for these companies and for these investors, because we're already starting with the trade agreement. We're not starting with nothing.
So it won't take 8 years and might take much less.
My expectation is we'll be able to arrive at something as quickly as the political leadership in both countries want it to happen. And so progressive trade agreements, I think, will be easy to reach.
Can we say that the British are the front of the queue in doing a trade deal with Canada?
I don't think we have to say that, because there already is a trade deal. I think the question is just how do we revise kind of technically to make sure that the preferential access for investors and companies stays in place.
Canada, like much of Europe, was rather against the idea of Britain leaving Europe. Does it have any effect on Canada at all?
The UK is our largest market in the EU, our third largest export market overall. So we have a significant interest in these negotiations and these discussions. Our objective, I think, is to see the UK and the EU emerge from the Brexit negotiations as strong, constructive partners, and that they will be continuing to be active players on the world stage.
But then there's Donald Trump, and he has already indicated that he's going to tear up the Trans-Pacific trade deal. I mean, how does that impact?
So the Prime Minister of Canada and President Trump had their first face-to-face meeting on Monday in Washington, and I know that as part of that conversation, they talked about the North American Free Trade Agreement, and I think we saw the President talk about some of the tweaking that would need to be done to the agreement. This is our largest, most comprehensive trading partner in the world, and so that is a really important trading relationship with us.
So you mean his bark may not be as bad as his bite?
Well, I think that you know, this is early days for President Trump and his administration. I think that it's important for him to understand the degree to which our economies are so integrated. 35 U.S. states have Canada as their #1 export destination. Our economies are incredibly linked and integrated.
You're very tranquil about this. Is this diplomacy or reality?
I think it's both.
High Commissioner, thank you for coming in.
Lovely to meet you, John.
Thank you. Well, we're joined now from Brighton by the Green MP, Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas, cheaper wheat and a lifeline after Brexit.
Well, it sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But of course, that's not really the whole story by any means. There's a very real concern about this kind of corporate-led globalisation, which is putting the profits of private investors above the public interest. And that's really epitomised by the fact that at the heart of this deal is a secret court in which basically private corporations can sue democratically elected governments if those corporations deem social and environmental regulations, for example, to be a barrier to trade. So this is dangerous when it comes to social and environmental standards. And when it comes to jobs, there's plenty of research that's been done, for example, by the Tufts University, which suggests there could actually be a net loss of jobs as a result of this in the EU. I think for farmers who are looking at how they are going to be profitable going forward, the prospect of cheaper food coming in from Canada could well be undermining people's jobs. And right now what we need are good quality jobs.
Well, it is hard to put a wafer between you and Marine Le Pen, who's just made a speech exactly along those lines.
Well, that's why I think it's so important that we have a progressive case against corporate-led globalisation. If we simply hand this over to the right, if we allow this to be an issue for the right and the far right, then we are absolutely playing into their hands. There are good, democratic, progressive reasons for being against the kind of globalisation that this agreement is the example of, and we need to be mobilising those.
But it is a done deal, and therefore it exists, and we presumably have to make the best of it. So perhaps the way to do that is to make it work properly for all.
Well, with respect, I don't think it is a done deal to the extent that it still has to be ratified in every parliament. That includes regional parliaments. That's about 38 different assemblies that this still has to be ratified in. Now, remember the scare that Belgium, the Wallonia parliament in Belgium, gave to this whole process a few months ago when they voted against it. It has to be agreed by unanimity. I think there's still quite a long way to go before you get unanimity between 38 different assemblies.
But of course, as we saw with Wallonia, a deal is done. I mean, if you put enough pressure on these little places, they fall into line.
Well, that isn't the kind of trade agreement that I think we should be wanting to see. And certainly if we want to be stopping the rise of the far right, which I certainly want to stop, then we will be playing into their hands unless we do stand up for little places like Wallonia and the people whose jobs are at risk as a result of these corporate-led globalisation deals that are not in the interests of the majority.
But dare I say it, I hear Donald Trump riding to your rescue.
Well, it's lucky I'm not in the studio with you, because I wouldn't be happy with that analogy as you would expect.
But he's very against free trade deals.
But exactly. But that is why we cannot just allow the right to possess this issue. There are good left-wing progressive reasons for saying that this kind of trade deal is bad for the jobs of ordinary people. It's bad for social and environmental standards. It's not good for workers. That is the case that we need to be making. And frankly, it's not made easier by the complete chaos of the Labour Party once again, which was basically split on this issue, half of them voting for and half against.
Caroline Lucas, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
More than 1 million elderly people across the country are left without the care they need. That's according to Age UK. A steep rise over the last year, and says the charity, evidence that a combination of spending cuts and rising demand have left social care, quote, in a state of collapse. Their report says that almost 250,000 people get no help at all, while others have to fight to get better services. Here's our health and social care correspondent, Victoria McDonald.
Real or perceived, this man didn't want to be identified talking about his care for fear of repercussions. He's confined to a wheelchair. He needs help with almost every part of his daily life.
They help me wash, dress, take me to the toilet, clean my teeth. I can't, for instance, Victoria, I can't put the toothpaste on the brush.
Now in his early 80s, he's had several battles with his local authority over his care needs. But he is most worried about the future.
They've already hinted that they want to, I need to find a voluntary group to do my lunch and tea call, or I'll have to pay more fund to provide somebody extra for those 2 calls.
It is, the charity Age UK says in a report today, symptomatic of a care system that is at real risk of total collapse.
We're hearing from older people with council-funded care whose packages are being cut. And we're hearing from providers who are saying, we want to get out of this market. We're not going to make a big bang. We don't want to make a fuss about it, but we'll just quietly give back contracts. We won't tender for new ones. Put those trends together in an area and you're looking at a real collapse of care. That's our big worry.
In 2010, Age UK estimated almost 800,000 people over the age of 65 weren't getting the care they need. Now that figure stands at nearly 1.2 million.
Charities, councils, directors of social services, even former health ministers have all told Downing Street and the Treasury that social care is at breaking point, that there needs to be more funding. But not just more funding in the short term. They all say that it needs to have a long-term and sustainable solution.
The Prime Minister herself has acknowledged this, although there is no agreement on how to actually move it forward.
I've been leaked copies of texts sent by the Tory leader David Hodge.
Last week at Prime Minister's Questions, Mrs May was accused of reaching a sweetheart deal with Surrey Council after they suddenly dropped plans for a referendum to raise council tax by 15% to fund social care. Surrey and other English local authorities have become increasingly vocal about the pressures they are facing as the population grows older. And while the Department of Health says it's putting more money into the system through the Better Care Fund, analysis shows that councils have cut social care funding by £160 million in real terms over the past 5 years. And the impact has been felt across England. But it's what lies ahead if there is no more money, and no more money soon, that is causing the most concern.
Now, if your daughter was autistic, would you recognise the signs? If she was having difficulty coping at school, would her teacher or doctor be able to tell? Conventional thinking suggests that autism mainly affects boys, but more and more girls and adult women are being diagnosed with the condition, and up to 100,000 could still be undiagnosed. Kemi Nzome has been to visit the only, yes, only school in the UK that's exclusively for autistic girls.
Well, I'll tell you what would be quite nice for a lesson, actually, girls.
A winter's morning at Limpsfield Grange, the country's only state school for autistic girls, where the world is lit a little differently.
Yes! My little buttercups, you're wonderful!
I'm different. I see things a lot differently.
We can just share our craziness.
I'm the octopus girl.
We all just know what it's like to struggle, which means we're a lot more accepting of anything, really.
Who would like to share their guess what?
Today's lesson, creative writing. The girls choose their own topics.
Social isolation.
Oh, I get that a lot. How did I not know that? I get social isolation
I get that.
a lot.
I get that a lot as
Now we
well.
need to do like a happy thing.
Social isolation, anxiety and mental health problems. Issues these girls, most of them only 15, have already lived with for years. Autistic boys are frequently identified when they're toddlers, but not girls. Walking the dogs, part of a therapeutic environment where the girls can just be themselves. Kezia and Felicity are bright, ambitious, and now studying for their GCSEs. But at mainstream school, they just couldn't cope. day after day, Felicity here would run away. She was close to a breakdown, or worse, and no one could explain why.
How do you feel when people don't understand you?
Oh, when people don't understand me, I feel really annoyed. Like, can you just listen and blah?
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Since she was 4, Felicity's mother suspected her daughter was autistic, but each time she brought it up, she was dismissed. It wasn't until last year that Felicity was eventually diagnosed.
My mum was happy because my mum been waiting for it for like 14 years. Since when I got diagnosed, then she was like, yes, I've finally been proven.
To get into the school, because
Even when Kezia was tiny, she could sense she wasn't quite the same as her friends.
I knew that I was too different to be normal. And every time I tried to say that, just people wouldn't listen. And it was just, oh, everyone's unique and all that, which is rubbish, actually, because there are people who are more unique and need help.
We've got Kezia's claim to fame here with...
At home with Kezia's mum, and an all too familiar story. No one would believe Kezia was autistic, even though it runs in her family. Her older brother had been diagnosed age 6. Kezia's mum says life had become intolerable.
She was in such a dark place beforehand. She just stopped eating. She was heading towards self-harming, that kind of thing. If she hadn't had somewhere like Limpsfield, I think there's a very real possibility she'd be dead.
All they'd needed was a doctor who knew what to look for.
He said, well, she's clearly on the autistic spectrum, isn't she?
And this took 3 years.
10 minutes. It took 10 minutes of somebody who knows what to look for. After 3 years of hell.
It was an answer to all the things which I didn't understand, because I didn't understand why I was always out of lessons and why everyone else could cope with it, but I couldn't. And I didn't understand why I said things certain ways and I acted certain ways and I heard things certain ways, and this was just why.
You weren't feeling great, were you, at that time?
From the experience that I've got of working here, when I get when I see young people who've not been identified until they're 14 or 15, often there has been really significant mental health difficulties. Quite often there's a high level of self-harming or an eating disorder alongside, because I think what the girls have been trying to do in the way that they do so brilliantly is they've just been trying to keep it together, and then they get to the point where they can't and they break.
From school to the real world.
Do you want to go, Poppy?
As autism in women is increasingly being recognised, more are getting diagnosed in later life, like Carly Jones, who's now a proud and happy mum.
Ready? Go!
But life's been tough. She left school pregnant and with no qualifications. Later, she developed an eating disorder.
Shall we try something less dangerous?
It wasn't until she was told her daughters were autistic that her own challenges suddenly all made sense. Age 32, Carly found out she's also on the spectrum.
I think a diagnosis is an absolute privilege, and I know some parents might be thinking, oh, you know, should I get them diagnosed yet, or is it a label? You've got to get any other type of label, and I think if you're diagnosed at 32, you've had every single label coming at you, to have the correct label is amazing, and to be able to realise all of these differences, they're not deficits, you know? And now I kind of look back at it and think, you know, always felt like a second-class person.
Well done, Cherry.
But times are changing. Carly's Lego-mad youngest daughter was diagnosed age 4. She'll get the acknowledgement and support her mum never had. Neuroscientists say the number of undiagnosed autistic females in the UK could well be over 100,000.
We need to go looking for the lost girls, the girls who might need a diagnosis but haven't had one, because I suspect that they're often excluded from school. They may be in prisons or young offenders centres, they may be living homeless. They're vulnerable and misunderstood.
And what every teacher here at the Grange knows, autistic girls can be identified just as young as autistic boys. We're just missing the clues.
I mean, boys get identified at the age of 2 or 3.
So why aren't girls?
I think because we're looking at the wrong things.
In a maybe 10.
I think, you know, even young girls bounce through things that they're interested in really quite fast, don't they? Whereas actually autistic girls will really love it for a really long time with an incredible intensity. That means this is the only thing that they're thinking about.
Jump up, kick back, whip around and spin!
And when we do recognise the signs, autistic girls can thrive.
As a job, I want to work for Ledo and I want to be a Ledo designer.
And I amaze my mum and dad with my computer skills.
These are like some of the most amazing people I've ever met.
Really, really close people. Yeah, thanks.
Open that door!
Oh my God.
Walk out it! Yeah.
I opened a door.
Yes.
En route to the next lesson, just enough time for some fun.
You go. Oh, okay. Go. Just go. Just go. Like that Kesha song, When I Leave for the Night.
Teenage girls with autism, accepted and understood at the only school in the country specifically for them, preparing for real life and the world outside.
That report by Kami and Zoran. Well, I'm joined now by the vocal coach and TV presenter Cary Grant, who has 2 daughters diagnosed with autism and Asperger's syndrome. Thanks for coming on the programme, Cary. A lot of that will seem very familiar to you, won't it?
Yeah, it's quite sad watching it when you look at a school like Limpsfield Grange and you think there's such hope there. But you think that's the only school in the UK? Come on.
How is that possible?
How is that possible?
How is that possible?
Yeah, it's...
One state school for the whole country.
Yeah, and often what the girls at the high-functioning end, you have 1 girl diagnosed to 10 boys, and so there's an underdiagnosis. So these girls don't really fit into mainstream school, but they don't fit into special, you know, a conventional special school either. So schools like Limpsfield Grange are pretty much the only place out there.
I mean, the vast majority of people watching this will have no idea what it's like dealing with that kind of family, living in that kind of family. Give us some idea.
Well, I think when you set out on your parenting journey, you think, well, I'm going to have that lovely family that sits in a restaurant and everyone looks and thinks, wow, what great kids. My kids will be under the table, they might be shouting, they might just decide they don't want to eat certain foods or from a certain plate, they don't want to sit in a certain seat. So there's lots of changes that you're making constantly. And so for my husband and I, we've had to find, we've got 4 children with special needs, but particularly the 2 girls in the middle with autism, we've had to find 4 different ways of parenting them.
And how old were your girls when you realised that they had autism?
Yeah, I knew almost immediately with my 3rd child who has autism. She was 3 when she was diagnosed.
So that was early?
So that was early. On the same day, I took my older daughter, because she was 7 at the time, and I thought, hang on a minute, I think there are some bells ringing for her too. So I was told on the same day, you have two girls with autism.
And you were lucky because it was done fairly swiftly. But, you know, one of the women in Kami's report had to wait 3 years, and then it was a 10-minute diagnosis.
There are people lost in the system. There are people who don't even get into the system. There are schools, GPs, health workers just not noticing what things to look for. And I think that's the issue, is parents, mums and dads know there's something different about this child, particularly if you've got more than 1 child. You know, this child is different. And yet when they try to flag it up, they're not listened to. And I hear that story over and over again.
But in order to diagnose those girls, especially the girls, in order to find out what's going on, it's not just a question of doctors being trained and teachers being trained and parents being trained. You have to change a whole culture of diagnosis.
You do. At the moment,
that is a huge ask, isn't it?
It's still geared towards boys, and so therefore we're looking for, you know, if a 16-year-old boy says, I'm into Thomas the Tank Engine, we might go, oh, that sounds a bit like, that sounds a bit odd. Whereas if a 15-year-old girl says, I'm into One Direction, we'd think, OK, that's pretty normal for a 15-year-old girl. So we've got to... it's the questions behind the questions to really get their social communication, to really understand the challenges.
And girls
that
are better at social communication often than boys, aren't they? So are they better at masking it than boys?
Perhaps. I mean, I like to call it camouflaging. I think that they just manage to just sit in, fly under the radar, and they don't get noticed.
What's your message to mothers and fathers watching this tonight who have autistic girls who don't think they're getting the help they need, or might not even know but suspect there might be something? What are you telling them?
I think go online, seek it out. We've got a great book done by Nason called Flying Under the Radar, which is a little booklet. And if you think, hang on a minute, my child seems like this child, take that booklet or take
and
your
don't
online.
be afraid.
Go to the GP, go to your Senko at school and say, please, could you get me a diagnosis? Please, could I have an assessment?
ask as many questions as possible.
Keep asking.
Cary Grant, thank you very much indeed. John.
And in another special report tomorrow night, Jamal Osman will be reporting on autism in the UK's Somali community. Now, after the break, the latest on President Trump's press conference and the Turkish author Elif Shafak on her latest work, A Story of Identity, Faith and Feminism. Elif Shafak is a household name in Turkey, where she is one of the country's most widely read and controversial authors. Her writing has defended minorities. At one stage, she was prosecuted by the government. But above all, she is fascinated by the struggle for Turkey's soul between the religious and the secular. This is also the subject of her latest work, The Three Daughters of Eve. Fatima Manji went to meet her.
It was an ordinary spring day in Istanbul, a long and sleepy afternoon like so many others, when she discovered, with a hollowness in her stomach, that she was capable of killing someone.
It's stereotypes that Elif Shafak enjoys killing. Unafraid to provoke, in the past she's found herself having to defend court charges of insulting Turkishness in a work of fiction. She often interweaves the personal with the political, philosophical and even mystical. Her 10th novel, Three Daughters of Eve, tells the story of three friends as they question each other and themselves on their purpose in life.
There are three women who come from the Muslim world, but their relationship with religion and God and faith is completely different. This multiplicity of voices that exists in the Muslim world today, this is not a monolithic world in which everyone thinks or acts alike. Women are asking the most important questions, particularly in the Middle East. And it's not a coincidence, because if we go backwards, we women have much more to lose than men.
You've said before that you experience pressure in being expected to write stories of Muslim women, and preferably unhappy stories of Muslim women. Do you think you've succumbed to that pressure in any way?
If you happen to be a woman writer from the non-Western parts of the world, especially from cultures where there's an overwhelming Muslim majority, you are labeled as a Muslim woman writer and then expected to write the stories of Muslim women. And I've always been very critical of this. I am critical when a function is attributed to fiction. Creativity should be endless, boundless. I can write about anything and everything as long as I feel it in my heart.
So as someone who describes yourself as a citizen of the world, how did you feel when Prime Minister Theresa May said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere?
Today, all across the world, there's an increase in what I see as tribalism, you know, the thought that if we go back into our tribes, if we are surrounded by sameness, we will be safer. Unfortunately, this ideology is on the rise everywhere across Europe, as we have seen in the States, and of course in Turkey, in Hungary, in Poland, we have seen these patterns of illiberal democracies.
What do you think is prompting that?
People always talk about financial reasons. Of course, economy is important, but I am saying solely by looking at financial or economic reasons, we cannot understand what's going on. We also need to talk about culture. We need to talk about emotions, perceptions. Emotions in general, they have been underestimated in mainstream political theory. For too long, I believe people in the left or liberal or Democrat circles have left patriotism to the nationalists. We should take it back. I never forget, I saw this road sign saying the Turks are coming, Turkey is going to join the EU, 80 million of them will be coming, so it's time for us to leave the EU. And I was sad to see that sign. First and foremost, it was a big lie, wasn't it? Because everyone knew that Turkey was not going to join the EU anytime soon. And even if it does join the EU, which I personally would like to happen, it's always possible to control movement. These things can be negotiated, but what really matters is that Turkey embraces liberal values, liberal democracy.
You see Turkey as being a blueprint for when things can go wrong in a democracy.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
What we have seen in Turkey is a government that came to power by using the means of democracy, elected, but at the same time using that power in order to suppress all the other critical voices within the society, and at times labeling them as betrayers every time anyone criticized. And there is a tendency, unfortunately, to look for populist demagogues, to think that we will be better off if we are guided by so-called strong men. Democracy is not just a bed of roses. It's not an easy system, but it is the best political regime that we as humanity could come up with. And we need to understand its value, because if we don't, we can lose it very easily.
Elif Shafak talking to Fatima Manji. Now, tonight's main news, Donald Trump has hit out at the media and defended his own presidency in a long and often rambling press conference, denouncing reports that his administration was in chaos. But let's go back now to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. Kylie, now, what did you make of it, and how long was it?
Well, an extraordinary 77 minutes, John. President Trump joked that tomorrow all the headlines from the crooked media would say he was ranting and raving. But this was certainly a press conference like no other from a president like no other. There were many memorable moments, but let's look at just one. This was the president pushing back against suspicions about contacts between his inner circle and Moscow, along the lines that he really doesn't understand why he keeps being criticized for being open to a better relationship with Russia.
We're a very powerful nuclear country, and so are they. I've been briefed, and I can tell you one thing about a briefing that we're allowed to say, because anybody that ever read the most basic book can say it. Nuclear holocaust would be like no other. They're a very powerful nuclear country, and so are we. If we have a good relationship with Russia, believe me, that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
So when you say they're not...
So beyond the rhetoric, there were moments of fact, a declaration that next week the White House will try to put in place a second version of its immigration ban, taking into account the court's findings that effectively 2 weeks ago undid the original ban that the president tried to put in place. And also he says he's optimistic now of appointing a new national security advisor to replace Mike Flynn. But this was really President Trump speaking directly to the American people with an appearance of candor to reassure them that everything is under control. Now the American people have to decide whether they believe it is.
Kylie Morris in Washington.
Well, it wasn't quite 77 minutes, but 53 minutes of this programme have come to a sad end. Thank you very much for watching.
That's it. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.